My name is Patrick Hall, and I'm the director at Clay Studio, and we are privileged to have the work of Don Reitz, selections from the Reitz collection. We have two people here that are very well qualified to talk about Don's work. The first I'm going to introduce is Peter Held. He's a museum director and contemporary arts curator for 3 decades. He has a art appraisal and consulting business in Phoenix, Arizona. He was a curator at the University of Arizona as well, and retired in 2014 to start his own consulting business. And Chris Rupp is our local ceramics guru. He is a professor at Westmont College. He's also the curator of collections at the Ridley-Tree Art Museum at Westmont. He's an accomplished artist in his own right, as well as a collector of contemporary ceramics. So with that being said, I'm really glad you're both here. And take it away, Chris.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here and introduce this exhibition, selections from the Don Reitz collection of Don Reitz work. Peter is going to talk a little bit about the history and timeline of Don Reitz.
Yes, so I got to know Don pretty well, meeting him at NCCA's, the National Ceramic Conference, and then both living in Arizona. And I tried to get up to Don's ranch. He lived in Clarkdale, Arizona, outside of Sedona, a beautiful piece of property by the Verde River. And we also took several travel trips together to Oregon and Wisconsin for various projects. But Don grew up in 1929 during the Depression, and I think anyone that lived through that time period, it affects them through their life. But Don was an interesting guy. Don really learned through his hands. He had dyslexia, so he had trouble in traditional learning methods in school. But throughout his early childhood, he was always very physical, no matter what he did. And then as he got older, the jobs he was employed with, he was a lumberjack for a while. He was a deep sea diver. He was a butcher. So his persona was about sort of the physical aspects of life and how he learned through his hands. And that certainly transcended in the way he approached his ceramic art. Just briefly, Don did his undergraduate school in Pennsylvania, and then his graduate work at Alfred University. And some of his fellow classmates were David Shaner and Ken Ferguson, both well known in the studio ceramic field. But anyone that goes to school at Alfred really gets a deep dive into the technical aspects of clay and glazes and firing kilns. So it really prepared Don to be free with the approach of his work, because he already had such a deep grounding in the technical aspects that it allowed him to sort of expand his vocabulary in the work he did. The other interesting aspect about Don's life and how it reflected in his work was depending on, the stage of his life. I mean, he was a well-known educator at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, did workshops around the country. Don had a very outgoing, gregarious personality. He was one of the best storytellers I ever knew. And he was just always fully engaged with what was in front of him, the people that were in front of him. He was always just deeply involved with both his daily life and the work he produced in the studio.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I never had a chance to meet Don in person, but I I feel like he was a close friend by my introduction with Brent, his son here in Santa Barbara. And also just hearing all the stories about Don and his career and his performative aspect of doing workshops around the country. It almost feels like we were close friends, but never actually met in person. I had the privilege of working with Peter and Brent Reitz on a retrospective exhibition here at Westmont College called Spontaneous Response, the Innovative Ceramics of Don Reitz, in which we published a catalog of work from the exhibition. It was really a wonderful opportunity to highlight Don's career, to be involved with the work that he created and just learn more about him and his influence within the ceramics field.
Well, to follow up with what Chris and Peter have said about my dad, he was a very physical guy, very gregarious, very outgoing. He lived it's a sort of, it can be considered a glamorous life and a rough life all at the same time. When you're a ceramic artist and you're really, he did work for the university for a while. I got sort of, I think, fed up with the bureaucratic end of that type of business and kind of quit before his, I think like a year or two before his retirement kicked all the way in. So he really worked, he really worked without a net, which there is a piece in the show that he made entitled that way. And I think he felt like, if you just have to go all in to get the best out of what you're trying to create. And, as a kid, it was tough. It was wonderful to see sort of have a rock star dad related to the ceramics world. And it was tough to see, the stresses, the financial stresses and whatnot of, when you get paid, it's great. And when you're waiting for a check, not so much. And I sort of took all that in, and of course, all his students and confidants and peers would always come to me as a young guy and go, "You're going to be a ceramic artist like your dad." And I was in those kind of those years where I was, would rebel against that and go, "No, I'm not going to do that," which may have been a mistake. I think I probably would have been a pretty good artist, pretty creative, but I also saw it was really a tough go. And, you have to be 100% all in if you're going to make it, just on your art. And Dad had no problem with that. He did a great job. People loved him. Great workshops, experience for anybody that I've ever seen, even now after Dad's passed in 2014. Any place I go with that have ceramic people involved, the first thing comes out of their mouth was about how fundamentally changing it was to go see my dad do a workshop. So that's pretty powerful stuff, and that's really what he was all about. My wife Jennifer luckily made a connection with Chris, so through Westmont and the Ridley-Tree, and that's how this whole show really has come about, because we had this great working relationship with Chris and the Ridley-Tree and Westmont to make the spontaneous show, and then Patrick and the Clay Studio offered to let us keep showing some of this great work. We had an incredible response to the show at the Ridley-Tree. So I'm so pleased to be able to have this work back out in, right here locally in Santa Barbara for people to see. And I'd like to thank, and then of course, Peter and has been a great supporter of us from the beginning, because when you're the kid of an artist and he passes, you've got a lot of great work and you need to figure out how to manage that. And Peter has been very, very helpful in all that. So, my sister also is been very powerful in getting us work and support, and she's still out there in Clarkdale, where Dad's ranch was. Dad's ranch is now run by someone else. It's called the Reitz Ranch. We let them continue using our name, and it's a great place for people to go to study ceramics as well. So with that, I think I'll hand it back over to the two experts, Peter and Chris.
Yeah. As we scroll through the images here, some people may not be familiar with the timeline of Don's career and the changes that happen from like earlier works that were definitely more traditional, more based on maybe traditional craftsmanship of the 50s, I would say. And then there's works like these that are more rough and are a result of wood firing. And then also a period of work which is referred to as the Sierra series, which these pieces represent. Peter, would you like to talk a little bit about what the result of these were?
Yeah, so, you know, as we mentioned, did workshops all over the country. In 1982, we did a workshop at the Penland School of Crafts in North Carolina. And Don loved driving, so he would hop in his pickup truck and drive all over the country. But on his return from this workshop, he was in a severe car accident and was hospitalized for a number of weeks. And during that time period, he found out that his niece, Sarah, was diagnosed with a form of cancer. So they were both in the hospital, separate hospitals together, convalescing. And as part of a therapeutic process, would exchange drawings. And at the time, I think Sarah was about 5 years old. She was pretty young. And Don was really inspired by the freedom and imagination of his niece. So when Don was able to return back working with clay, he started experimenting with these childlike drawings, and it became one of the stronger series of his work. I mean, prior to that, you know, in the 1970s, Don was referred to as Mr. Salt, was realized as creating a resurgence of salt firing glazes to his work. And that's an aspect of Don's work that carried throughout, that he never glazes to hide a sort of tactile quality of clay. He always liked the clay to speak himself in a sense. And the firing allowed him to do that. And the same with the Sarah series, you know, with his gouged drawings and inscribed lines, using colored engobes to achieve his color palette. And I don't know if there's one slide. He had a sort of a demonic image called the Refrigerator Man, and that was the Don Reitz's devil that was always poking him and prodding him to move forward. Let's see. This is, yeah,
the shield
that's
right here. Yeah.
Yeah, on the shield. But you could tell, you know, this series is vastly different than his other work he produced over the years. And the Sarah series lasted from 1983 to approximately 1988. And it was during that time, especially when Don moved to Arizona, he was exposed to the Anagama kiln at Northern Arizona University and working with Yukio Yamamoto, a Japanese potter and kiln master, where Don started focusing on the possibilities of wood-fired ceramics, which really took him through the rest of his career.
Yeah, I went back to this image because I love this image because it shows Don working on these Sarah series images or works, but also you can see all the drawings here pinned up to the studio wall that Sarah had exchanged with Don, and he's using these as reference as he's working on this more narrative body of work. Also, I think one of the questions that I got a lot as guests viewed the retrospective show here was about these figures within the Sierra series. You referenced Refrigerator Man, but also there's a lot of images of these other characters, and there's flowers, he used rainbows, I think, and trains quite a bit. And what would you say, both Peter and Brent, what would you say about some of these characters? What are they exactly? What do they represent for Don? I know I've heard that the breast sort of figures are nourishment and healing. What are some of these other things? There's a serpent in this one.
Yeah, I think by and large, I mean, they're all biographical, and Don drew a lot from his childhood experiences. He told me about, when the carnival and fair came to town, he was the little kid that snuck in inside the tent. I've seen some of his that refer to that specific experience. But I think a lot of it with Don is just sort of stream of consciousness. And, certainly he had meaning to it. Brent, I don't know if you have any specifics as far as some of the designs he used.
I don't have all the specifics of the characters that were in my dad's head. But I think, one thing that he used to tell me about the characters, if you look at the pieces closely, you see that sometimes the serpent started off as, a flower or something, and then it turned into the serpent, and maybe the character here with that's holding the red character here that's holding the flower. It's like, it seems to me that a lot of this was about the conflictive sides of good and bad, of good and evil, and that we all have all those parts inside us, and that they all work together. And I think Dad would be someone to say, you're not doing yourself any good if you're trying to suppress one over the other, or that they balance each other out, or you need to be aware that things could be really good here, but you've got to hang on because something's coming this way. I mean, I think it was had a lot to do with balance in our lives, and being prepared for whatever cards you get dealt, and doing the best you can with that.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me about all the work that I've been so blessed to be around for the last couple months and a few months to come, listening to you guys talk about who Don was and the kind of person he is, or he was, and how he affected people, and his energy level and his physicality, and all those qualities are reflected in spades in the work. The work is so physically exuberant, and like he's got his body involved in this so much. I mean, and any potter or ceramic artist knows how, when you're working with large pieces of clay, perfect slide, by the way, it's a workout, man. You got your legs and your back and your butt and your shoulders, and you're wrestling with this. And so there's so many connections, although I've never met the man, there's so many connections between how you're describing him and how his work feels to me. It doesn't need translation almost. It's so consistent. And I admire that about artists, when their life and their work match. I think there's an authenticity that comes through in all the work that he's done. So I appreciate it. I appreciate this show being here at the Clay Studio.
Yeah.
Thanks. Seems like you nailed it there, Patrick. I think that Dad was all about, what was happening right now, and he just would put his all into every single work. I mean, I love the picture. I'm sure a lot of people that'll view this are potters and are, used to throwing on the wheel. But if you could imagine, throwing up a big vessel on the wheel and then throwing another 4-inch in diameter coil on top of that vessel, and then standing up on the chair of the wheel and continuing to pull the thing up.
Right.
It's pretty impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, the other aspect of Don, towards his latter life, probably when he was in his 70s till his passing, he had apprentices in his studio. So, when his body started to fail physically, he had these younger assistants helping to create the work. And, it's just an example where his mind was extremely active and free until his last day. But when he wasn't physically able to make certain things or needed help throwing elements on the wheel, he had assistants that really understood what Don wanted to achieve, and it was a very symbiotic relationship in these apprentices and Don.
I like that during these later years, Don was known for making these big works and T-stacks and 75-pound platters and things like that, such as this column piece. But the later years, he started making these works that were quite a bit smaller in scale. And it's almost as if the larger scale didn't necessarily mean greater impact. He was doing essentially sort of the same thing, like this smaller Kachina work, that still yielded the same kind of power and spoke the same kind of volumes that the larger work he had been making earlier did.
Yeah, he really started expanding his sort of visual vocabulary with the Kachinas, the towers, and then he got into the what we call tabletops, with the thrown rings, but glazed a whole lot differently in more brighter colors, as an example, with this triptych. And it's just amazing. I mean, he was able to sort of adapt as his body needed to, as his imagination kept on moving forward. I mean, he never rested on his laurels. He just kept on changing, evolving, making new work, new series, trying new things. He was always, when he started in school, he was always looking at the abstract expressionist painters of the day, de Kooning and Jackson de Pollock. And, you get a sense of that freedom, intuitive brushwork and coloration, like the abstract artist did throughout Don's work, even with his unglazed wood-fired work, the way he added in appendages and slash pieces. And sometimes he would just be enthralled with the trimmings after throwing a section and incorporating those trimmings because he liked the freshness of the form. So he was just an incredible artist that never set limitations on himself and was always open to the possibilities that clay gave him and what he could do with it.
Yeah. Spontaneity. I think we titled the book here Spontaneous Response, because spontaneity, I think, is something that really summed up his career. But he also seemed to always work in a way that spontaneity came from decades of working with clay. It wasn't something that he sat around and thought about and I'm gonna try this. It would happen even, I think, during workshops. And I think that's why a lot of people were mesmerized and taken by his workshops, not only the performative aspect, but the fact that he could spontaneously take something in a whole new direction or spontaneously put something together that just really revealed his years and decades of working with clay.
Yeah, I could jump in on that just for a second. I remember he told me a story. I have a lot of, we don't do a lot of stories. There are a lot of stories around my dad, but he did tell me a story one time when I was learning. I'm a professional harmonica player by training. And I remember the first time I went to a workshop to learn how to do that, I thought I was a pretty good harp player before I went there. And I remember driving back down the freeway calling Dad saying, man, I thought I knew what I was doing. And I don't know anything about this instrument, after 3 days of being, trained by these professionals. And Dad said, yeah, that's what used to happen to all my students. I would have students come in to me and say, I just want to make art. Man, I just want to make art. And he'd be like, yeah, well, what tools do you have to know how to make the art? Well, I don't know. I just want to make it, And he'd say, well, it takes a long time, to Chris's point, to understand the tools, the techniques, the time, you get out of something what you put in it. And I would say that's one of the biggest lessons I learned from my dad. And he loved teaching all his students, the tools that they needed to understand in order to make the art that they wanted to make. And I think, to Chris's point, I guess at the workshops, he would just start going off on some other crazy direction, and people probably were kind of in awe of how he did that. But he did that because he had the technical ability, put in the time, put in the effort to be able to do that.
Right.
There's an awful lot of technical.
Oh, go ahead, Patrick.
I was just going to say that there's a lot of technique involved in clay, as most people that's worked with it can be overwhelming sometimes, but after you've built a relationship with the material for as long as Don did, and some of us, you lose some of those limitations, and you can really free yourself up. And I'll go back to what I mentioned before about looking at his work. He's like Peter Pan. He's so free. How do you? I love that he just never corralled himself. And lots of artists, like lots of famous artists, they find an iconic thing they came up with, and they'll paint that same thing for 30 years because the museums like it and collectors like it, and they sold it, and they didn't have. I think Don's work is courageous in that he'll pivot and change like the body of his work on impulse.
Yeah, that's right.
And I also think that it's like that's what a lifelong learner does. You get through one series of work as an artist, and you learn about it and what it has to offer, and you make some choices, and it informs you in your next one. And he's a great example of somebody whose work pivoted constantly. And I think he learned and made some great pieces, and then he goes, well, I may be done with that. I'm gonna shoulder some new responsibility, and I'm gonna learn about this other thing. Really like that about Don's work.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the changes are a reaction to what happens in life as well. Like the car accident led him to a whole new body of work, but also retiring from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and moving to Arizona led to a whole nother body of work of working with wood-fired kilns and making wood-fired pots. So a lot of it, I think, also came as a result of life experiences and unexpected changes, and showing Don's resilience of, I'm gonna roll with it. And you know, he could have been Mr. Salt his whole career if he wanted to, but didn't just rest on doing that.
Mhm.
Hey,
Yeah, I think the other thing too with his wood-fired work, you know, he would travel around the country to other potters' wood kilns, Frank Boyden in Oregon, Dan Anderson in Illinois, Chris Guston in Massachusetts. He spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg, Florida at the train station. So I think, you know, he, you know, like anyone wood firing at first, you feel like you're out of control, that, you know, the kiln is going to do what it's going to do. But with any ceramic artist that's dedicated a good portion of their life to the wood firing process, you know, you get to understand the kilns, you understand the placement of the work. Do you want it by the firebox? Do you want it towards the back? How much ash you want on it? And it's still not going to be exactly how you might imagine. There's always the element of surprise. But I think, you know, all those other artist kilns offered something else for Don too. You know, they used a different type of wood. And it was also about community building and personal relationships. And that's what Don was all about. I mean, he embraced as well as he was embraced by the entire ceramic community. And, you know, students that interacted with Don, you know, 30, 40 years ago, you know, still think he was such an influential person in their lives. It's just, you know, it's hard to calculate the impact Don had on so much of the ceramic community.
Yeah, certainly.
Peter or Chris, the piece that's shown right there, the kind of totem, big tall pieces. Could you elaborate on those a little bit about how, or if you know how they evolved? And as I live with these pieces here in the gallery, they command a lot more of my attention on a daily basis, and I'm curious about them.
Yeah, I went to this slide because as Peter was talking about unpredictability of wood firing, this particular piece came from a firing that they call the ghost firing, where unexpectedly they unloaded the kiln and found all these pieces that had this ghost-like gray quality to them. And it was something, from what I've heard, you could probably speak more to this, Peter, but it was something that he tried to replicate and couldn't really ever have happen again. It was maybe due to atmospheric conditions, or do you know more about that?
I don't, other than it was, yeah, I mean, for lack of a better word, sort of a fluky firing where, you know, maybe they cooled it quicker than normal, or maybe it got more oxidized. But yeah, it was a very unique body of work. But so, you know, Don worked on, you know, we could call this a column. He also made bag forms that are sort of these large scale vertical pieces. He had what he called flat tops, which was basically a column, but then a slab on the top. I think, you know, it just sort of evolved from, you know, the skirted vessel series, the T-stack series. You know, again, it was about Don. It was about the physicality of it, you know, the scale, being able to work on larger surfaces, being able to explore, you know, different avenues he could take with basically a form, you know, a column form, and how to make it his own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that with this work, he started out as a functional potter, and really as much as he strayed from functionality while he made T-bowls his whole career, a lot of his work speaks back to the functionality of the pots that he made earlier, such as these tea stacks that they have a teapot influence to them, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Or even the platters here, while these platters are platter in form, they're not something you're going to use on your dinner table. You're not going to serve Thanksgiving on them, right?
Yeah, I think, Don, when the whole debate was raging in the craft field in general in the 60s and 70s, what is art, what is craft? Don never made any apologies for being a functional potter, as his work evolved more sculpturally, he didn't call himself an artist per se. He was still a ceramic artist, and I think he was very fluid as far as pottery forms versus sculptural forms. And you made a good point. Even his latter work that isn't strictly functional still refers to the history of pottery and pottery forms, that he always embraced that.
It's with several thousand years of history of clay being predominantly used for the vessel form. I think it's in our DNA as a potter. Even if you eventually will expand off of the functional form and use it as a template to do sculptural, more expressive pieces, maybe, without the limitations of it being purely functional. And there's certainly a rich history of ceramic artists worldwide that are doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, it's hard for ceramic artists to find their voice and to create something that's uniquely their own. Don was fortunate. He found early on in his career, and even though it evolved and changed, his work has always been recognizably his, no matter if he was working on the Saracens or his Baroque salt glaze forms from the 1970s to the later wood-fired works. He created a very unique vocabulary within the ceramic medium, and that's not easily done.
I agree.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to bring up in this conversation was Don's work ethic. And I would say maybe the intertwined life of a full-time studio artist. And I think for Don, from what I've had from conversations from Brent, Don was not really one to take a vacation or take a break, or it sounds like life really was about creation and making, and kind of just living, wake up in the morning and the first thing you want to do is make a cup of coffee and get out to the studio.
Well, I can say without a doubt that was pretty much the essence of what made Dad happy, what made him tick.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very prolific artist, and he just loved making work, and he also loved the workshops. He really enjoyed those. But as far as vacations go, the only vacation, he would go up and see Frank Boyden, and they'd of course be firing a wood kiln, and during the downtime, they go try to catch some salmon every now and then. But other than that, the only vacation that I can remember that he actually took an actual vacation was with me. And we went to a house that some of his collectors were watching. That was Edward Hopper's house in the East Coast. And we we got to stay there and, walked on the beach and looked out at the water for a few days. And I think that was about enough for him. He wanted to get back home and go back to work. It just, that was his joy. No question, was just loved to work,
Yeah. It's something that I think is hard for people that are not involved in the arts to understand, that you maybe go to work for a 9-to-5 job and you come home and then you have your family life and your work life, and which isn't necessarily the case for artists. I think my students here, when I teach in my ceramics class, I have a lot of students that come from business majors or kinesiology majors, and they find it hard to believe that your life can be so intertwined, that making and creating artwork is one and the same as living your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly true of Don's practice.
Good point.
Yeah, if you don't view your studio time as work, it's more play and enjoyable, and count your lucky stars, you get to do it every day.
Yeah.
It makes for a very satisfied life, and it's not always easy for people outside the arts field to understand that. But just being around artists for the last 50 years and the joy they find in creating or teaching or doing workshops, we're a fortunate few at times.
Yeah, certainly. And I think in Don's case, it shows that he was working the last couple of years of his life, and I believe was even in the studio the day that he passed, wasn't he?
Right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he actually June Kaneko and Ree Kaneko came to visit, and Dad was always very excited to have his fellow artists family. As Peter mentioned earlier, he was the whole ceramic arts scene. Was a lot about camaraderie and just community. And the Kanekos came to visit Dad, and he was quite weak. He had a heart condition. But he would always go to the studio. Donna was the caregiver there to take care of him, and he would go to the studio, when he could. And as Peter mentioned, he had at that time was Ben Rotai was his last assistant. He always had great assistants to help, so he'd go down there and try to direct them, create some things, do some work, and then actually he got so weak to where towards the very end, just this is the very, very end, he went down to the basement and he had Ben build this gargantuan, which we still have somewhere, this gargantuan canvas that he had him put in the basement because he couldn't make it really he had a golf cart with big Texas longhorn steers on the front that he drove around the Reitz ranch. But he would go down the basement, we'd help him down the stairs, and then he had like 4 buckets of paint and a broom. And he just would that if you can go to that slide of jamming, that sort of that same kind of thing, but this is like a 12 by 12 piece of canvas that he just would stick this bucket in the broom, and he would just start doing these slashes and and he did it for 3 days. Don and I actually had, and he was just, really in his last legs, literally, but he could just get enough energy to do those types of things. And then when June and Ree came, he was very happy to show them the shop and the compound, the whole Reitz Ranch. I mean, he had a bigger infrastructure than many universities. And then he said, well, I'm going to go up to lunch. Donna took him up towards lunch, and he started to fail on the way there. And then he actually got in the kitchen, and he basically died in his daughter's arms. So he was actually working. He worked up to the last day that he passed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Inspirational.
Which I considered just such a blessing, because as we just went over here, working was what it was all about. Making the art was what all was about. And he took it up to the, right up to his last breath.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm really pleased with the conversation that's taken place here. I feel so much more well-informed about Don and his work and his family and how he lived. So I want to thank you all for participating. This is an unexpected gold mine of information.
Well, and I want to thank you and the Clay Studio and Chris and Peter also, Patrick, for being gracious enough to allow us to get the work back out in front of the public, because I mean, that's where it needs to be. People need to be able to see it.
We all feel very fortunate to have the work here.